would, okay? As soon as he gets on, we'll sing him a happy birthday. I believe he's 51 today.
Schneerson. So instead of putting Schneerson on as the author.
So, Anne, I don't know if you heard that or not, but today's the rabbi's birthday, so I'd like to open up with us singing him a happy birthday.
That's lovely. We sang him at Minyan this morning.
Oh, you did? Oh, cool. Okay. So he gets it again.
You'll have to represent us by singing, because if we all sing together, it's going to sound terrible.
Nah, it's okay. Don't worry about it.
He can live with it. He's 51.
That's right. There you go.
51.
Hey, how you doing?
Wow.
My grandbaby is 1 today.
All right.
Ooh,
Cool.
well, happy birthday to your grandbaby too.
We got our tickets to go and visit.
Where is he?
Woohoo.
She's a she, and she's in Madison, Wisconsin. So we're going to go on the 22nd and stay through Pesach.
Oh, nice.
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
It looks like this thing I'm trying today is working. So
Oh,
there's
you
one
sound
square that's my visual and one square that's me dialing in.
You sound so much better.
Okay. I have come up with a solution. This is good.
Hi, Lenny. I did not read anything for this week. I am a bad person. So,
Okay.
So we're still on the same chapter that we've been on.
oh, good.
Hey, Lenny. How you doing, man?
All right, how about yourself?
I'm doing good.
I'm gonna try and get my hair cut eventually too. Am I having trouble with my camera? Is it coming in and out?
It's coming. It's fine.
Oh, because I see what's going on.
Yeah, my hair. I get my first vaccination on Thursday. After a couple of weeks after my second vaccination, I go to the barber for the first time in a year.
So how did you actually go about getting a schedule for your vaccination? Did you do it through like the
It ain't
state
easy.
site? Yeah.
There's a number that you call, and it takes about 4 days and about 12 hours before somebody comes through to you and gets the vaccination. It's not easy.
And then you did
You're
it
supposed to
through,
call at 7 a.m. And for me, the first time, it took me till Thursday. I started on Monday. By after 2.5 hours, by 9:30, somebody actually talked to me, and I got
so
it.
is that through Multnomah County or through the state? Do you know?
Multnomah.
Yeah, Clackamas is a real, it's weird. You know, they have all these emails and all these wizards and all these different things, but when it comes down to it, it's very hard to figure out how to actually get the vaccine. So,
And it's impossible online. It just takes
Right.
you immediately to a dead end.
right, I had the same thing, yeah.
There it is. A 1, a 2, a 3. Happy
Happy
birthday
birthday
to
to
you.
you.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear John. Happy birthday to you. And many more. Now we'll go on mute.
We can't hear you, Rabbi.
Go ahead and move your mouth and I'll just do your voice for you.
Do we have to sing again?
Hi, Jackie.
You're on mute too, Jackie.
There's
But
post.
I know. She said, how are you, Ann? You could just answer her on mute.
But you're not on mute.
You're on mute.
I'm
No,
just
I'm not.
Not
fine.
anymore.
We have a first grandchild, a little boy who's 14 months old.
Oh,
And he's all the way over in Tualatin. So.
that.
Don't get to see
Okay,
it.
can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Yay.
Weird. Anyway, thank you for the birthday greetings. That's what I said. I'm having a wonderful birthday. And let's see here. And oh yeah, I wanted to say I was greeting Sean Vandor when I first realized you couldn't hear me. Sean Vandor, my good friend, who he and I, if you recall, taught a discussion. We led a discussion together early on in the days of COVID, April or something, May, I don't know. So glad to have you here with us.
Hey, thank you.
All right. Well, we are going to continue in our discussion of chapter 10 of Pillar of Prayer. And Cheryl, you're here videoly. I thought you were just going to call in.
Yes,
We'll see.
I'm doing both because I'm so sophisticated. So my video is here
Yes.
and my dial-in is here. And so I can see and hear and talk.
Nice. Okay, good. So as I indicated to people by email and in conversation, I'm trying a slightly different approach, which is to kind of do an overview of the what I think to be some of the core ideas of this chapter, and rather than delve into this teaching or that teaching. So we'll try that, and at any point along the way, if you want to interject and refer us to a single teaching, or you want to delve deeper into a teaching, I absolutely want to do that. I'm just starting us off this way. So the first thing that I wanted to say is that this first of all, I think nearly everything in this chapter is actually the teaching of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polonia. So he along with the Maggid of Mezerich was one of the two main students of the Baal Shem. Because remember, we don't really have any of the words of the Baal Shem Tov. So everything we have is from his disciples, and these two, Yaakov Yosef and the Maggid of Mezerich, are really the two first people to say, "Wow, this Israel Baal Shem Tov Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, really has something profound to say," and they attach themselves to him. And they are the ones who shared his teachings. Everything in this chapter is from Yaakov Yosef of Polonia in his collection of teachings called Toldot Yaakov Yosef. I don't know if that's available in English or not, but clearly parts of it are, because they're woven, his teachings are woven throughout here. And just by the way, if you look at the beginning of the book here, or somewhere. Yeah, so if you look at Roman numeral page 26, that's XXVI for those who don't know. It has just the abbreviations of all of the different teachers. because he doesn't recite them by their full names, or by the full names of their works. He just kind of gives abbreviation. So this guy is abbreviated as TYY for Toldot Yaakov Yosef. Anyway, so I think all of the teachings in this chapter are actually from him. And so in order to understand this chapter, or at least some of the teachings in it, some of the most important teachings in it, we have to have an understanding of this word Shekhinah. And I know it's a word everybody's heard a lot. We've all heard the word Shekhinah here and there. And some of you may have already a really good idea of what it is. And if you do, then just bear with us. And for those others of you who don't, it's probably a word you've heard a lot. So Shekhinah is one of the many names of the 10th Sphira, right? Of the 10th and lowest Sphira, quote unquote lowest. And I put the air quotes in there because the Sphirot don't exist in time or space. They're really, more than anything, they're a metaphor or a symbolic language to describe these theological cosmic realities. And the highest of the Sphirot, which we've talked about, is called Keter. Keter we can't really know anything about because it is so close to God's actual self, God's Ein Sof, God's infinity of being, that Keter is just too much pure divine light for us even to comprehend. When I say divine light, that's also a metaphor. But as that light begins to create the physical world, the created world as we know it, it becomes more and more occluded and wrapped up with materiality. And God's the word that we use to describe that divine light as it is most occluded, most covered up, that is within the physical world, is called Shekhinah. I should say that's the lowest Sphira, when God's light is most occluded, and that is called Shekhinah. For those who took Shari Ora, who studied Shari Ora with me, you'll remember that this is also called Malchut, and it is also called in Shari Torah. In Shari Ora, Chikatili's work, it is Adonai is the name that he focuses that chapter on, Adonai. So just as a reminder, when we say Baruch Atah Adonai, we're actually referring to Shekhinah, right? We're talking about that lowest Sphira. We don't mean the word Lord, which is how Adonai is translated. We're talking about Malchut. One thing I want to make clear, and this is so important and often misunderstood, Shekhinah is not interchangeable. The term Shekhinah is not interchangeable with just the physical world of creation. And the reason I say that is because it is possible to exist in the physical world and have no relationship with Shekhinah, right? If you live a life of total obliviousness, no inwardness, no awareness, and just like in the world of ego, which, let's be honest, we spend a lot of our lives there, and that's kind of normal in a sense. You're not really connected to Shekhinah. Shekhinah is always there, but we don't always, really what we mean when we say Shekhinah is when we are connected to it through our consciousness and awareness. Okay, so in Shari Ora, it's never a great idea to combine different Hasidic and Kabbalistic works, especially when they span, when the distance between them is 3 centuries. But it's safe to say here that Shekhinah, as Jikatilia mentions in the Gates of Light, that all paths go through Shekhinah, right? You can't. It's impossible to access Hashem except through Shekhinah, because we exist in the physical realm, and Shekhinah is the one that's is closest to us. So Shekhinah, let me say a couple more things, and then I'm going to pause, see if there are clarifying questions, not comments, clarifying, and then I'll move forward. And then later we can pause for deeper questions. So when can we really connect to Shekhinah? When does Shekhinah really dwell? Okay, because the word Shekhinah comes from the Hebrew verb lishkon, which means to dwell, because God dwells with us. That's where we get the same verb as where we get the word mishkan, right? The tabernacle, because the tabernacle is where is the thing that will enable God to dwell among the people. So Shekhinah really means dwelling, and that's why it's sometimes translated as the indwelling presence of God. So how do we access Shekhinah? Well, the less we access ourselves, the less connected we are to our own restricted consciousness, and that is to say ego, the more we are necessarily, there's a direct relationship, the more connected to Shekhinah we are, okay? So, the gateway to accessing God is by getting outside of ourselves, by diminishing our own attachment to our own egos. That's kind of modern terminology. The Baal Shem Tov does not use the word ego, but the idea is clearly the same. So first, let me just pause there and see if there are any clarifying questions before I attach this to how it's going to play out in this chapter. And Prawl.
Am I right in understanding that you do the Sfirot in order? Like you can't jump one. You like so Shekhinah is that gateway, that first connection with God. Does that make connection with the Shekhinah somehow less valuable, less good than the connection with the higher Sfirot,
right?
Attributes of God?
It's a really wonderful question. And part of the like not very compelling, but just historically important part of the answer is that there's a real difference. I think I may have been talking to Sean about this or somebody else about this last week, that there's a real difference between how Shekhinah is discussed in different Kabbalistic works. So this is just kind of an FYI, that in the Zohar, connecting to Malchut and Shekhinah is almost seen as like, that's the goal, to just be with Shekhinah all the time. But in the later Kabbalistic works, Shekhinah is really, or sorry, I should say in some Kabbalistic works, especially Hasidic works, the Shekhinah is just seen as the gateway, and that ultimately we want to make ourselves up to Binah, which is the highest level that we can attain. You can't go any higher than Binah. So does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah. So
I
there's
forgot what you asked.
different opinions about how valuable Shekhinah is.
Right. By the way, that's always, if you hear a rabbi say, well, there's different opinions, and then move on, that the rabbi doesn't know. It just reminded me because I used to say that when I would get stumped in Kabbalah. I'd be like, well, this depends what text you read. Because it has the double effect of not only blowing off the person, but making it sound like a tremendous amount. But anyway, so yes, it is used differently in different texts. And, so I'll just leave it at that for now. Harvey, you're on mute.
So this is the same Shekhinah, who's the female aspect of God, who's the bride that we welcome
right.
Kabbalah Shabbat. Same
one. Yep, that's exactly right. So, yes. So if you think about Lecha Dodi, the bride, it's complicated. It's actually complicated, and I have not done a deep dive on Lecha Dodi because sometimes we'll talk about. Okay, so the bride in Lecha Dodi is actually Shabbos, the Shabbat bride we're welcoming in. But Kabbalistically, Shabbos is also Shekhinah, at least sometimes. And but the short answer is yes. When you see Shekhinah, it's talking about the God's presence that's resting with us, okay? And to your point, this is really exactly where I wanted to go, the bride image, because in teaching number 136, which I think might be the first, or is it on page one? Oh, it's number 136. Hold on.
Yeah, that's the first one in the chapter.
Okay, what page is that?
170.
170.
Thank you. Yeah, so he refers in either the first or second to the bride, or actually I think in both of them. And in classic Kabbalistic texts, in class, and I think we talked about this a couple classes ago because this just gets like nakedly sexual. In classic Kabbalistic texts, the Shekhinah is, as Harvey said, described in female, in a gendered female language, and there's interesting reasons for that. You can't really separate them from the the patriarchal context within they're highly gendered in patriarchal terms, but they're, if you can hang out with that for a minute, they're actually useful to at least understand the Kabbalistic underpinnings, because Shekhinah or Malchut doesn't have any light of its own. Of course, light is a symbol. It's a metaphor. It's not, God. We use the word light to describe God's energy, which is another symbol, another metaphor, radiating into the world. That is, that whatever divine force it is that brings blessing and sustains the world. So Shekhinah or Malchut, also symbolized by the moon. Okay, the moon is a symbol of Malchut and Shekhinah. Why is the moon an appropriate metaphor? Because the moon doesn't have any light of its own. Right? The moon only reflects the light of the sun. Okay. Now the sun generally, and this is a little off topic for us, but the sun, I think, is generally associated with Tiferet. Okay. So the sun itself is radiant. It's the radiant divine light that God is like shining into the world. Malchut reflects the light. Okay. So imagine that if you're just in a just wrapped up in yourself, you're in a deep funk, you don't see any goodness in the world, and you're just thinking about your problems and woe is me. It happens to us all. God willing, we don't spend too much time there. The divine light you're not seeing the divine light, and you're not reflecting the divine light. But then at those moments when we open ourselves and we expand and we can see beauty in the world, and we sense all of the possibilities and the hope, then it's like we've opened ourselves up and the moon is full and we're reflecting the divine light. And then we actually shine the light back. So this is where, to connect to the patriarchal, this is why the Kabbalists said that used the feminine to talk about Shekhinah, because the feminine, according to their view, is just receptive, right? And I think they mean this both biologically, right? But also I think they probably meant it as personality type. Like women, according to this view, are simply receptive, and they're also there's no nice way to say this, the receptacles. Okay, I'm just trying to convey in clear terms the language of the Kabbalists.
I think we can all accept that these are not your views.
Thank you. Right. Have I said that enough times? I guess I'm reflecting my own anxiety and discomfort. But the bride has to be willing and has to be seeking her male partner, okay, her husband. Now, in order for the union to take place, who is the husband? The husband is symbolized by, in these teachings. Well, actually, before I say that, the husband is classically represented by Yesod, right? Yesod is the next sphera up, quote unquote, up from Shekhinah or Malchut. And Yesod is like the force that like penetrates Malchut or penetrates Shekhinah, okay? Because Yesod is the force that kind of gathers all of the different cosmic divine resonances, balances them and channels them, and unifies them and brings them as like an active agent into Shekhinah. So when you have, and here you can mix your metaphors, either when you have the light shining on Shekhinah and the full moon is receiving all of that light that she can, or when you have the sexual union of Yesod and Shekhinah, then you have unity, okay? So it's interesting because, Anne, this kind of going back a little bit to your question, when you say, like, is Shekhinah kind of what we're shooting for, or I don't remember if that's what you asked, but I addressed that in this answer, that like as soon as you're connected to Shekhinah, you're actually also connected to everything else, right? Because the light that you're sensing when you're in Shekhinah consciousness, the divine light, the hope, the inspiration, the blessing, the connectivity you see, the connectedness you perceive around you, that's actually light that's being channeled through Yesod, right? Shekhinah has no light unless the light is shining on her through Yesod. And Yesod, in turn, is carrying all the light from the sphere above her. So it's a little, it's hard to make separations because ultimately these are all one. We break them into different spherot so that we can talk about them and we can comprehend them. But they're, of course, all unified. So what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting in teaching 136 and I think also 137 is that here you get an unusual kind of language here. And the Toldot Yaakov Yosef mentions, I think it's towards the somewhere in 136, but I could be wrong. But the Toldot Yaakov Yosef tells us essentially that he's getting a, how does Kalas translate it? He says, Kalas translating the Toldot Yaakov Yosef says, this is the gist of the best teaching, although these are not his exact words. So he kind of he's giving a riff on what the Baal Shem Tov said. He says that prayer is the Shekhinah, the supernal bride. Okay, so this is a little bit of a riff on what I was saying before, right? So he says, we're wondering, how do we connect to Shekhinah? And he says, in a sense, well, that's easy. Shekhinah is prayer. Now, obviously, when he says that, he doesn't mean the prayer book. He doesn't mean everybody filing into the chapel looking like they can't wait for dinner. He means like the process of elevated prayer itself. When you're in that and it's flowing through you, you're actually in the presence of Shekhinah, right? Which is a beautiful, I think, a beautiful way to kind of articulate it and to in a sense concretize it, or to relate it to something that we can imagine or we've had experience of. So prayer is Shekhinah, according to this take. All right, you're going to get other representations that are different. Let me pause there. I saw that Cliff had a question or a comment, and to see if there's anybody else. No, Cliff, what was your question? Okay.
Well, let me unmute. I was typing another message. So there's an interesting question. I think that that in an all-male environment, you couldn't reach Shekhinah and move upwards because you couldn't visualize the connection to another level. I mean, so it'd have to be that this is actually an endorsement of women in society to reach a higher level, women in religion. I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm just pushing an envelope here a little bit. Because, as you say, the sexual innuendo is at a significant level, but maybe that's because there's a justification being searched for to reach an epiphany. Strange uses of words, but maybe. But then the other thing you just said also sort of clicks in is that, but there's, we on Shabbos we had, the other rabbi, not Shabbos, on Sunday, he was talking a little bit, and one of the things he said is, each one of that there's no real set of prescribed prayers that every community does. One community does this, one community does that. So how do you, as you mix this and mash this all together, is it the concept of a prayer for 15 minutes or 20 minutes or a certain level of prayers? I mean, how does this all play?
Right. Yeah, I mean, to that I would say, no, I think there's no one prescription. And also I would say, and I'm certainly not saying anything controversial here. One can absolutely have an awareness of Shekhinah without prayer, without the formalized prayer of the Siddur. And so, there's no one answer to that. It's a state of consciousness. Now, for the rabbis, they felt like prayer was our best shot at that, and that was the regular prescribed way for Jews 3 times a day to make, clear away everything else so they could just focus on trying to get to Shekhinah. But there's also Jewish meditation. There's, as you may have heard me talk about Rabbi Nachman's prescribed walks in the forest. Like there's no rule for when and how to connect to Shekhinah. But certainly prayer is a time where you're trying to connect to Shekhinah. And this teaching is assuming that prayer and Shekhinah are the same. Then you could either say, well, yes, tefillah at shul with your community is where you touch Shekhinah, or you could look through the other end of the telescope and say, no. Anytime you sense Shekhinah, you were calling that prayer. I think they probably meant the former, but I just wanted to open that possibility.
Interesting.
But anyway, so now here's what's interesting is that he calls in 136 or 137, in talking about the union of the bride and the groom. Now, usually when we talk about bride and groom, we're talking about Yesod, right, which is the 9th Sphira, coming together with Shekhinah. And once you have that, you've created real unity, right? Like if all of the Jewish people, according to the Kabbalah, if all the Jewish people suddenly awaken to Shekhinah, we would have total unification, right? But what's interesting in his language, he throws in a different term that I've not seen before. So he says that Sadiq is the Shoshav, or which who Kallis translates that as the concierge. That Sadiq, okay, and I'll explain what that word means in a minute, is the concierge of the bride. Okay, so now what is the concierge? So what's odd about this is I looked up this word, the Shoshav, because I didn't know it in the Jastrow dictionary, and it turns out that traditionally Shoshav is actually somebody who accompanies the groom. This is just a little bit of a footnote. You don't really need to know this. So I guess that in a traditional wedding, there were Shoshavim. And the Shoshavim would, I guess, escort the groom to the chuppah or something like that. His friends and other, spiritual co-travelers would escort the groom. But here, he uses the word as the Shoshav as being somebody who's a concierge for the bride. Okay, and again, who's the bride?
Shekhinah.
Right. The bride is Shekhinah. And in terms of like to use an anthropocentric term, like or framework, where does Shekhinah reside?
In the world. In
Right.
Malchut.
Right. In the world, in Malchut. But another word for Shekhinah is Bnei Yisrael or Israel. Right. So no, I don't want to talk about the problems of universalism in the 21st century and whether we want to associate Shekhinah with the Jewish people. But for the Kabbalists, the Jewish people were the ones who had the potential for awareness as to where God's presence was in the world because they had the Torah. And therefore, Bnei Yisrael is also the bride. Okay. But the bride, if the bride is, watching football and golf and playing video games and eating and not paying any attention, the bride is not ready to greet the groom and there can't be any unity. The tzaddik, okay, is the concierge, the escort of the bride. So what is it tzaddik? Just based on your understanding of that word, what is it tzaddik?
I thought tzaddik was holy man.
Okay, tzaddik is a holy man, exactly. So
or
tzaddik,
more religious or more involved in prayer or
right. Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, you're onto it. The tzaddik in classical rabbinic language, the tzaddik is, the person who does the mitzvot and is ethically upright. The Rabbi Hillel was a tzaddik, and all of the rabbis of the Gemara are tzaddikim. In the context of the later Hasidic world, the tzaddik is also like the spiritual master and the teacher. So the tzaddik is the concierge of the bride, and what that means is that tzaddik is the one who is guiding the people to elevate their awareness, to come out of ego, to be searching for God. The tzaddik is the Baal Shem Tov, it's a little harder with the Baal Shem Tov because he didn't really have the the circle of his Hasidim in the way that the later rabbis did. But the tzaddik is Rabbi Yisrael, the Rim, or the Sfat Emet, with his many, disciples around him. And he's trying to raise their awareness so that Shekhinah will be fully present and ready for the groom.
So is this a difficult, I mean, you make it sound like it's a very difficult process, but it seems to me that from the outline here, should be pretty straightforward, right? I mean.
Well, what do you mean? Describing it or the doing of it?
The doing. I mean, you pray, you get engaged in prayer, you meditate prayerfully to a level where you connect.
Right.
It sounds to me like you don't need 30 or 40 people, and you don't need 100 years to teach people how to do that, in my mind, I think. But maybe it's part of the progression of age. Maybe age has something to do with it.
Right.
Maybe it's much more difficult for somebody younger to hit this level of connection in prayer than somebody older.
Does anybody? I want whatever Siddur you're using, man. Can you just give me your Siddur? No, I'm kidding. Does anybody else want to address what Cliff said? Because I think it's a really fair and interesting point. Anybody else want to just reflect on the challenge of consciousness and prayer? No.
Well, I think if it were that simple, there wouldn't be, millennia of people talking about how to do it and trying to teach how to do it.
Right.
Well, and it comes and goes too. It doesn't come and then it doesn't just stay there.
Right.
For anybody ever.
Right. Yeah, that's right. It's elusive. It's elusive. But well, first of all, yeah. I mean, Cliff, the other thing to say, Cliff, is, and I'm not arguing against what you're saying, I'm just giving my perspective. I think that there's a difference between paying attention in prayer, like I'm going to really try here and I'm going to read the words and I'm going to listen to the rabbi, and really having your ego dissolve in prayer. And I mean, if that's easy for anybody, then, that's awesome. And they should keep going to the next level. But I think for most people, that's not a regular occurrence. Sarah Sturz, you're on mute. Go ahead.
Yeah. There, in earlier chapters of Menachem Kallis, quite a bit of time was spent talking about prayer, readying oneself,
Yep.
eliminating the distractions, elevating yourself, et cetera, et cetera. So little people. So it seems to me that one of the benefits of age is maybe having done that for a long time or work at it for a long time, which means that maybe some things are easier or closer to attain because of that. And then responding to your question.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's definitely true that the rabbis believed that, we've all heard the idea you can't study Kabbalah until you're age 40. So part of that is because before you could start to study Kabbalah, you had to be so knowledgeable of the core texts of the Gemara and the Mishnah and everything else, and the Midrash and everything, and all the halacha. But part of it is also, it's asking a 25-year-old to be able to stay in that level of consciousness is a lot to ask. Listen, I think it fluctuates. It comes and it goes. It's constantly elusive. I can just say that in my own experience, it's certainly not something I can just, tap into when I want. And sometimes the more I try to chase it down, the farther away, the more elusive it is. But in any event, what we're talking about is really transcending ego, and the tzaddik. And this is here's where it gets really interesting. So he talks about the tzaddik, the role of the tzaddik, the righteous person, the spiritual leader, preparing Shekhinah, right? Why does, this is going to be a weird question, maybe. Why does the tzaddik want to prepare Shekhinah, want to lift up the Jewish people to have God consciousness? Who's that for? Why is the tzaddik doing that?
God.
Right, exactly. So part of the answer is, well, he wants to be a good tzaddik and wants to help his people have an experience of Hashem. But that's not the full Kabbalistic answer. The full Kabbalistic answer is that this is the entire purpose of existence.
It's a union.
That's right. Creating a union with, allowing God's awareness and God's self to be totally unified is the whole ballgame. It's the, as you know, as Frank Zappa said, it's the crux of the biscuit. So that's why it's his job, is the people's job is to have God consciousness in the realm of Shekhinah unify with God's self. And that's the whole task. And so here's what's really fascinating though, is that there's a playing with language, a deliberate playing with language. Maybe playing with language is not the right word. The language is doing two things at once in teachings 136 and I think 7, which and I know I'm spending a lot of time on those two, but I think those two the first two are key to understanding the whole chapter. Is that on the one hand, Tzaddik, on the pshat level, on the lower level, the simple level, that Tzaddik is, as I've said, a spiritual master, a spiritual teacher who's trying to elevate the consciousness of Shekhinah. But Tzaddik is also the name in classic Kabbalistic literature of the Sphira Yesod. Okay, so forget everything I've said for a moment heretofore. So traditionally, Kabbalistically, the ninth Sphira, known as Tzaddik, and of course you've noticed by now that the Sphirot have tons of different names. And if you read Jikatilia, you know that, there's, I don't know how many names of God he explores in that book, but it's got to be something like, 200. So Tzaddik is coming down trying to unify with Shekhinah, and Shekhinah is trying to open herself to Tzaddik. Okay, so when the Toldot Yaakov Yosef, the student of the Baal Shem Tov, talks about Tzaddik being the escort of the Shoshav of Shekhinah, the concierge of Shekhinah, he's also suggesting in a way that's very profound, I think, that Yesod, that God's desire, God's yearning to unify with creation through the Jewish people, that somehow Yesod is both other from Shekhinah, right? Because if Yesod can be because if Yesod needs to unify with Shekhinah, then he's separate from her. But if Yesod is also, Tzaddik, Yesod is also her concierge, that means in some way he's already attached to her, right? And this is I think a great example of why the Kabbalah and Sphirot are so unbelievably difficult to talk about, because as I said, we're talking about them as discrete and separate, but they're all, of course, of one. And so I think that's what's being alluded to here, is that somehow Yesod is both escorting Shekhinah so that she'll open up to God, but also Yesod is the force that's coming down within her. So this is a good place to pause because we're going to shift gears in just a minute. Questions, comments?
Yes.
Yes, Harvey.
I want to know how universal this is. Are we talking about the unification of a few people, of a congregation, of a country, of a nationality, or of the world?
It's such a great question. That's such an important question. I think that the answer is, look, ultimately, I want to say two things. There's no doubt that on the one hand, the authors of the Zohar and the Baal Shem Tov and the Toldot Yaakov Yosef and the Magid and all of them weren't really concerned with the rest of the world, right? I don't mean morally. I just mean that they spent their time not really talking about universalism. That just was not a concern of 18th century Judaism in the way that it is for us, for historical reasons. It just wasn't on their radar to wring their hands about, God, does this apply to everybody or just us, right? The focus of them was the Jewish people, right? That's on the one hand. And there's just no way to get around that fact. For sure, the Baal Shem Tov talks about the Goyim, talks about the, you know, the non-Israelites or whatever, that for sure, all of the literature does here and there. It is, there's no way to argue that that's a central concern of these texts. But on the other hand, of course, they when they're talking about the world and God's desire to unify with the world, they know ultimately unity is unity. Ultimately, they don't have an answer to what this looks like, but ultimately they are talking about somehow in the Messianic era, a total unity being achieved. All right. And then, you know, classical Jewish literature has its answer for what that looks like, but it's just not something that the classic Kabbalistic and Hasidic texts spell out very much. However, and then I just want to throw this out there, and then I want to get back to our text, because this is such a, your question is so beautiful and important. We could spend a whole time on it. I would say that is a concern of what people have started to call neo-Hasidism. That is, people who are seriously engaged with the Hasidic history and teachings in the 21st century, who, because of our historical situatedness, we are very concerned with universalism. It is something that contemporary authors have struggled with and written about more. And, you know, I would say you can probably sense an ambivalence in a restlessness in my, when I talk about these things, that I try to demonstrate an integrity and loyalty to the text on the one hand, but the part of me that lives in the 21st century occasionally tries to universalize this language, so that we're not just talking about the importance of Bnei Yisrael elevating their consciousness, but ultimately we have to be talking about everybody. And Paul looks concerned.
Is
I
that
don't like
why
it when
they-
he's concerned.
Is that why they add the Kol Yoshvei Tevel at the end of Oseh Shalom?
Right. And, or even in the Mourner's Kaddish, you see that. You know, I've wondered where that came from. And I don't, does anybody have the answer to that? Why some congregations, not why, but what the source is for Kol Yoshvei Tevel? Yeah. So for those who don't know, in the Mourner's Kaddish, the very last line in Oseh Shalom, people say, in addition to Bnei Israel, they say Kol Yoshvei Tevel, which means all the inhabitants of earth. And I don't know if that was like a phrase that was found in a Geniza once, or if that's entirely modern coinage. I'm not sure. Yes, sir, Mickey, and then let's, I'm going to move on.
Just two quick things. One is going back to Harvey's comment, Bayom Hahu Yeh Adonai Echad U'Shmo Echad, that sort of, in a way, ties the universalism idea.
Yes.
But my question is,
right,
did this whole thing did they tie this into the idea of Mashiach at all, or is Mashiach something separate that is outside of this world?
No, it's not separate. No, they absolutely, the Kabbalistic writers do occasionally talk about Mashiach, and what they mean is that, you know, exactly what you just said, on the day when God will be one and God's name will be one, right? God's name is another word for Shekhinah. So when Shekhinah unifies with God, then you have Mashiach. So yes, that is absolutely within the Kabbalistic linguistic framework and discourse.
But all of this is not to bring the Mashiach. This is, it's the same thing. That's when you're going to get to Mashiach.
Right.
And all this.
Yeah.
No,
yeah, that's it.
I don't understand it that well.
Yeah, I actually don't understand. I don't understand it enough to spell it out beyond what I have. I don't know if that would be Mashiach, like when we're in that unified state, like, yes, that's Mashiach, or whether that just triggers, you know, a guy to ride in on a donkey. I don't know. But it's, as you know, I like to say, I think it's knowable. I just don't know it. And in fact, didn't I see a chapter on messianism in here? Yeah, well, there's messianic prayer, so we'll get to that. Okay, so now I want to change a little bit. So now he talks about, throughout the chapter, there's a reference to the Rasha, to the wicked. He says, Toldot Yaakov Yosef says, the wicked. I'll tell you what, just for the sake of ease, if I don't specify somebody else and I say he, I'm referring to Yaakov Yosef of Polonia, in whose name most of these teachings are in this chapter. Okay. The first student of the Baal Shem Tov. He says the wicked are called garments that are oppressive to the tzaddik. Okay, the wicked are called garments. Now, a garment is something that obscures. right? It covers something up. So sometimes it's translated as obscurations. The word in Hebrew is lavushim, right? Which is why it's a garment. That's really what a lavush is, a garment. And the garments are, they obscure what's underneath. But of course, what's underneath is what ultimately the tzaddik is concerned with, right? Revealing what is hidden, right? In the material world, what is hidden is God's light and God's unity, right? It doesn't look like God's light is here in the physical world. It doesn't look like there's unity in this world, but that's because it is covered up. It's hidden behind garments. So we ultimately, the tzaddik wants to unveil those garments to see the truth. But the wicked are garments because they are oppressive to the tzaddik. Okay, this is Callus's language. And but another thing, so when we hear that language, the wicked are called garments. I have the image of these bad guys surrounding the tzaddik and like trying to take him off of his game, or they're sinners, or maybe they're non-Jews who want to oppress the Jews, and they're making it difficult for the tzaddik to do his thing. But I think that it's important to know that I believe we can just reverse the language and say that the garments are called the wicked. In other words, anything is sometimes in Hasidic language and Kabbalistic language, anything that obscures the divine light is called the wicked one, right? So your ego could be wickedness or the evil person. And so it's like this personification into the wicked person of anything that serves as a garment to prevent you from seeing what's true and what's real. And I offer this, and I'm emphasizing it because this is one of the ways, one of the resources that we have to make sense of passages in our tradition, not to cover them up, but it's just it's a method of an exegetical approach to wrestling with texts that identify how the evil have to be exterminated, right? We have to get rid of the evil ones. We have to get rid of those who are evil. I'm not pretending that our tradition doesn't have a strong imperative to confront people who are persisting in bringing evil and suffering to the world. I'm not trying to elide that. I'm just saying when the Torah says you have to exterminate these people, one of the Kabbalistic strategies that we have is rooted in our Kabbalistic text, which is, we're talking about those forces, spiritual, psychological, or material, which prevent us from seeing the underlying unity of all things. Okay? So I wanted to make sure to share that in the context of this discussion of the wicked. Cheryl?
I just have a question about that connection of the word garments with wicked, because it seems like this idea of obscuring garments isn't just about like things we obviously know are bad, that beautiful things are also considered garments. It's like the words of the Torah is a garment and things like that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's important. Thank you for saying that. And actually, I would say, while all the texts share a concern about the wicked, I would say it's even more common I would say it's how the language of garment is used here is actually more exceptional. The normal way is talking about how Hashem's light is like beautifully garmented in Torah or in the life of the tzaddik. That is actually, I think, more typical language. So I'm glad you pointed that out. Yes, anything and everything is a lavush for divine light, right? In a covering, a garment. And that's one of the features of living in Shekhinah, in the realm of Shekhinah, of Malchut, is that we don't get to just see plain old exposed divine light naked and in front of us. It always arrives in a container or in a garment. And so that means that sometimes it's beautifully garmented in Torah, and then we can easily and appropriately access, well, I shouldn't say easily, we can appropriately access that, knowing that we're looking for the divine light in this beautiful garment. And other times it can be concealing in a more nefarious way. So I'm glad you said that. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit because I want to talk about like kind of the something very distinctive in the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov that comes up when we talk about the Rasha, the wicked, whether we're talking about an individual or a spiritual force. There's I don't know how to say it other than a disposition, maybe. There's a disposition in the work of the Baal Shem Tov that probably is shared throughout almost all Hasidic texts, but it's much more prominent in his. And there's almost like a lightness about him in this disposition, which is that in response to an internal crisis of confronting ego or confronting another person's wickedness or wickedness in the world in a way that would cause us to lose faith, in response to that internal crisis, the tzaddik does not give up, and the tzaddik does not despair, and the tzaddik does not really lose faith. There's just this sense of either, and we'll talk about this in some depth, either I can learn from this, or there's just an assertion that underneath that apparent evil is goodness. Like that evil is just a lavush, that is a garment. And underneath that is magnificent, perfect, beautiful, divine love and light waiting to come out. And so there's this lovely, the stereotypical distortion of like the Hasidim is happy and they're always dancing and yay and joy, and Rebbe Nachman's not, there's no despair in the world, and they're always happy and they always have a big smile, like in the kind of those trite Jewish paintings, that always show like the friendly grin of the Hasid. Like there's something to that. There is something deep in that, which is that there is a core in these teachings that that within all suffering, there is the possibility of finding revelation and finding joy underneath it. And so the Baal Shem Tov has this very positive sense about him, this very positive disposition, and we talked about it you can, before we go into depth about it, and I'll pause here after this, that if you remember the teaching from whenever you see like a wicked person, or you notice something wicked in your fellow person, like that's something you can learn about yourself through that, right? And I mean, it goes deeper than that, but you just take that on its own, and it's already such a beautiful response to like irritation, and to just like the normal anxiety of living a life in conflict with other people, rather than just saying like, yeah, there's evil in the world and you got to get through it. Rather saying, ooh, I can grow in as I conflict against these things that bother me. There's lessons in everything around me. It's already shows that response. So let me pause there before we go much deeper into that concept, because I think there's something very, very profound underneath all of that. Questions, comments? Mickey.
How do you explain the Shoah with that kind of attitude? Where's the light underneath that? Where's the lesson? How does that fit into this picture that's being painted?
That's a very real question. I'm not even gonna. I can't offer a real answer to that. I don't think I have an answer to the Shoah. I know I don't. I mean, I don't have a theological response to the Shoah. I mean, not one that would be satisfying. I guess let me say this. I don't have a response to your excellent question that would allow us to have that sunny dancing disposition that I just described, right? But I think there is a Kabbalistic answer, which is just when the world continues down the path of not taking seriously the different balance theological and cosmic forces at play in the world, and when it doesn't emerge from ego and power, horrific things can happen. And the fact that Kabbalah has a language for describing these things and a vision of what perfection looks like doesn't prevent them from happening. But again, in terms of what do we do with the image of the tzaddik who sees joy everywhere in the face of the Shoah, I don't have an appropriate answer to that. There is a more direct answer, and Ann Prahl, I'll get you in a second. There's a more direct answer, which is, I guess the simplest answer is we don't find joy in human suffering, right? So there's never a let's dance in response to that. However, we've talked about, as a tangent here, I've mentioned to you, and I think somebody told me that the Rabbi Rubinstein or maybe Rabbi Glazer just did a teaching on the Piaseczna Rebbe, the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto,
Yeah.
right? So that is a way where we have a very unusual ability to really ask that question, because he was wrestling with those questions in real time. I mean, any Hasidic rabbi or anybody working in mysticism in the second half of the 20th century certainly was also wrestling with those questions. But he is a rabbi who's in the Warsaw Ghetto. He's watching his family be taken away and destroyed. And he has this legacy of teachings from the Baal Shem Tov. So he's actually a source to take very seriously your excellent question. Ann Prahl?
The segment of chapter 10 that took the most of my brain to try and understand kind of feeds into that, which was 143.2 on page 179, that's titled "A completely holy and pure person cannot recognize evil in anyone."
Right.
That would kind of explain that constant state of joy, is if you're not able to recognize. But it made me uncomfortable thinking that so many of our prayers are about being able to discern, to make distinctions between things. And I'm not sure that it's a goal. I mean, not a good goal to not be able to see evil in anything.
Right.
I mean, I get the Baal Shem Tov's point that if you don't have any in yourself, then you can't recognize it in somebody else because of that part that you just referred to, where if you recognize evil, it's because of the parts in yourself that are also needing work. So if you don't have them, you don't see it. But surely we want to be able to recognize evil so that we can avoid it or counter it or do something.
Right. What a great point. And I just think that this is part of this. I don't want to call it a paradox, because I don't.
But there is no paradox. But there is no paradox, because in fact, evil.
Wait, Cliff. Let me just respond really quickly, and then I want to hear your thoughts. It's not a paradox because I don't want to say that because I haven't thought about it deeply enough yet. But I think that this is this really fascinating aspect of our spiritual tradition and even of the mystical tradition, right? Because on the one hand, the Kabbalists and the Baal Shem Tov and everybody sees unity everywhere, like everything is God, and yet the Zohar is insistent that the mitzvot really matter, like whether you put tefillin on that are kosher or not kosher, whether you daven on time, whether you eat this or that, all. And people sometimes, I think that there is a misunderstanding in latter day, like neo-Hasidism. There is a misunderstanding that they think like, well, you had people who were halachic, and then you had the Kabbalists, and I think you all know better. But the reason for that misapprehension, I think, is because there is a tension that can be very, very confusing. So on the one hand, how can we be a people obsessed with discernment and creating categories and dialectical thinking? And on the other hand, be obsessed with seeing the unity in all things. And I think there's, it's a fascinating feature, a very beautiful and very essential feature of our tradition, that we say both things have to happen. So when we say that we see the good in all things, it doesn't mean that we should allow evil to persist, but it means that we know that underneath everything, I think this is maybe a way to resolve it, underneath every apparent suffering is an enduring potential for good. Like the bottom fundamental core of all creation is goodness waiting to emerge, and all things unified in that goodness. But in the meantime, we live in a world of separation where we have to make distinctions between good and evil, and the reason that it's so important for us to make those discernments is because we can't tap into that good, or I should say that good can't emerge until human beings can create the unity out of it, right? So our discernment is required to bring about the goodness and the unity that's within all things. Cliff Hockley.
Nicely done. But the question in my mind is, we keep having rules that are focused on evil or evil inclination or, shotness or whatever it is. There are rules after rules after rules after rules, because in fact, people have a hard time breaking out from whatever they consider to be evil
Right.
or not evil. And then there's the other level, which is sort of my other question, which is, there's evil. There are people that are just evil. They don't know how not to be evil.
Right.
Versus the evil inclination, which is you're breaking the light rules. You're breaking some rules. I mean, why do we do Yom Kippur? Because God already knows that we will be breaking rules. I mean, it's already a foregone conclusion that we're going to be breaking some level of rules that we've built into this religious process.
Right.
Which is different, though, than people who are absolutely, I'm not going to use the word clinical, but who would do things that none of us in our right mind would ever consider, which is
right.
Goes back to Mickey's point, as being humanly appropriate. So, is the language that we're talking about at the Hasidic level focused on the higher level about the evil inclination, and really doesn't adjust itself to those people who are absolutely just evil people?
Right. It's a great question, but no, I think the answer is no. And I would also say, if it did, like if the language was conditional, like, well, we're not talking about really, really bad evil here,
Right.
then it wouldn't be useful to us.
Okay.
And it wouldn't be true. It wouldn't be worth studying finally, certainly not in the 21st century. It's a great question, and it's tempting to try to say, well, it applies to most things, but not the Holocaust, not Stalinism,
Right.
not, disease that ravages hundreds of thousands and millions of lives. Then it wouldn't be useful to us. And I think that I love how you put that. It's a great question, but I think that maybe a way to circle back to Mickey's question, and maybe to shine some light on the other excellent questions that have come up, is to say that in the face of the horrific and overwhelming evil of the 20th century, and our different understanding of the world that we have now, is not so much the image of the dancing Chassid, but rather to talk about hope, the persistence of hope in the face of evil. And I think that Hasidism, I'm certainly not alone among spiritual traditions in this, but I think the way to process these spiritual teachings that talk about that goodness is under everything, and that there's always a good waiting to be revealed, is this gives us a stance of hopefulness, of constructive hope in the face of terrible evil. And it says that no matter how bad things are, one cannot bring despair to a final, you cannot have despair as your final destination. It may be part of your human experience. It may be inevitable that you're going to have passing feelings of despair, but that ultimately Hasidism is affirming underneath everything is goodness waiting to emerge. And therefore we take stock of our responsibilities to be agents in allowing that to happen. And we do so from a position of hope that inspires us to act. I think maybe that's a way that we make sense of the Baal Shem Tov in our era. By the way, the other kind of a misleading assumption that's behind it's my bad, not your bad, my presentation of all of this is as though unspeakable evil wasn't invented until, the 20th century. So of course, I mean, the emergence of Hasidism is inextricably bound historically with the ugliest, kind of most brutal suffering of the Jewish people in Europe, right? In pogroms and different persecutions that emerged. And so it's not as though this tradition was ill-adapted to take on, the Shoah. I mean, obviously the Shoah was something unprecedented in history, but the Jewish people very well knew suffering in the Hasidic era. Lenny or somebody? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that maybe one way to look at it is that what is divine and your divine vision is never, I'm sorry, I don't know, it's kind of a big point. It's a little hard for me to grasp. That the evil in the world never taints the divine.
Right.
And that your vision of the divine is always your vision of the divine. And that's how people, the rabbi, what's his name, from the Warsaw Ghetto, saw that your relationship to Hashem never changes from the evil around you. And in that state, you don't recognize that evil. It never touches the divine.
Right. That's beautiful. That is very beautifully said. And I think you did find the language for it. Yeah, that's right. That when we're responding to evil, we're not responding to Hashem, right? Holiness and God's chesed is never being tainted. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have anything to add, but I'll just use that to reflect back to the Kabbalistic teachings, which we have not really done in depth in this class. But if you remember, those who have studied the Kabbalah, that Keter and Chochmah are, and really Bina as well, although Bina is more complicated. The first three Sfirot stand outside of the created world, right? Divine, because they can't be, they're unsullied by the created world because they're just constantly beaming the renewal of creation into everything. Right now, as that divine light kind of filters down into the physical world, it can be concealed, and it can be, that's when evil can emerge through human activity or even naturally. But what's really continues to animate at the core of creation is this fountain of Keter and Chochmah, breathing purified good godness into the universe. So I think, Lenny, that's what came up for me as you said that. Okay, so now sorry, Jackie, did you have a hand up? Nope. Get that fist down. Okay, so so now I want to talk about because I want to talk about now some relational dynamics that emerge in this chapter. One between the individual and herself, the other between God and the individual, or God and the people, I should say, God and humanity, and then between one person and another. Although I won't necessarily tackle them in that order. So the first thing is, let's see, I don't remember what number teaching this is in. In my notes, I did a poor job of making reference points. But in any event, there is a teaching, and let me just, give me 1 second to look at my own notes here, because I don't remember if it's in the main text or if it's in a note that I had. Well, there's a point at which in the Tolda Yaakov Yosef, he says, and I guess I didn't cite it in my notes, but he says that the pain faced by the individual is actually the pain of the Shekhinah. Okay, the pain faced by the individual is actually the pain of the Shekhinah. Therefore, pray out of regard for the pain of the Shekhinah, and spontaneously the pain will be removed from you as well. Anybody want to take a crack at trying to put into some usable language? What is that astonishing teaching? What can that mean? Anybody notice that when we were reading?
Can you say again where that is?
Yeah, well,
in
unfortunately,
the
yeah.
text?
Let me just see if I noted it here. I don't think I wrote it down in my notes. Let me just see really quickly here. One moment. Well, it's probably in 138 or 139, but I at the moment I can't.
Oh, yeah. It is in 138.
Oh yeah, there it is. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So what?
Okay.
Yeah. So it's on page 173, and it's teaching 138. What sense, if any, did you make out of this wild teaching? How is our pain the pain of Shekhinah?
I think of it as, if we're always somehow keeping in consciousness the idea that everything is one, then whatever we're experiencing is indeed what Shekhinah or God is experiencing.
Right. Right. Exactly.
And so I would very literally say it's like if I'm experiencing some pain in the world, or I'm having, or maybe more easily, if I'm seeing something in the world that pains me, that if somehow I try to fix that pain in myself by fixing something in the world that's painful, it's fixing God. It's
right.
Helping release God from that pain.
Right. Right. Ultimately, I think this incredible teaching is asking us just to expand our consciousness in the largest possible way. All there is Shekhinah in the world that we know. All there is Shekhinah. It's just a question of how realized human consciousness is about that. Right. Everything is just God, divine energy. Now we perceive that that's not the case, right? I perceive that I'm here and Shekhinah is just like this story about this thing that's out there because I'm real and I don't see Shekhinah. But that I'm an illusion. Shekhinah is all there is. And so if Shekhinah is like, in a sense, like God's self trying to, through us, become conscious of God's presence in the world and God's unity in all things, then every thought, everything that happened, everything that befalls me is really happening to the Shekhinah. So, but then the real question, and if people didn't get that, I don't blame you, and we'll come back to it. But then the second part of the question is when he says, therefore, pray out of regard for the pain of the Shekhinah, and spontaneously the pain will be removed from you as well. I think there are two ways to understand this. I think one, maybe the less satisfying for us or the less important for us is intellectually, if I understand that I'm praying for Shekhinah, then as soon as I really grok that, as soon as I really comprehend that, there can't be pain to me because I won't really be here. It's really, I'll realize that this is just Shekhinah. And if my emotional pain is overwhelming me, and I realize that it is really the pain of Shekhinah, of God's consciousness on this earth, then the pain dissolves from me because I'm witnessing Shekhinah in pain. Okay. But that's, in a way, that's really just like an intellectual parlor game. How does that really help us? I think the deeper level of this teaching, it taps into what we were discussing before, which is if I can have a perspective on my personal experience in light of what it really is, which is part of this much greater universal divine energy in the world, that realization itself is therapeutic. Like I'll have the beautiful awareness that underneath that suffering is actually something very, very good and beautiful, which is Shekhinah. Right? Does that make some sense? Sorry, Sean, and then somebody else had a hand. Sean, Harvey, Lenny.
Yeah, no, I like the way you're phrasing this. It just made me think of, well, I think it makes it easy to see your own suffering as not only your own.
Right.
But I think one of the worst things about suffering, and we all know it because we all suffer, is that it so easily makes us feel alone.
Right.
In our suffering. And so here's a particular instance, like you said, going back to the last section or the last teaching, that there is this kind of infinite light at the end of the tunnel, if you will, where there is always light in the darkness from this perspective, because suffering is not just one's own. And that immediately takes you out of yourself.
I think, right.
I know it's not that easy, but it's.
No. But I think that's right. That's a nice way to put it. By taking you out of yourself, that's why it's therapeutic. You suddenly see, oh, it's about something much bigger than me. And at a minimum, I'm sharing this with Shekhinah, but more properly, I'm seeing this happen to Shekhinah. And there's compassion and there's getting out of myself. That's right. Harvey and then Lenny.
I don't know. The image that came to me was, the metaphor was, I don't know if this is legitimate or not, but I once had a horrible toothache and it encompassed my whole universe. When you have a toothache, that's all there is. There's nothing else, right?
Yeah.
And I think it was a Percodan, and I took 1 or 2 Percodans. And after a few minutes, that universal feeling of suffering, it didn't go away. The pain didn't go away, but it occupied lesser and lesser and lesser.
Oh, that's interesting. Right.
Okay. So it started out as 100%.
Yeah.
It was down to 5%, so I could look around. So that's one thing. The other thing is,
if you take enough of that stuff, Shekhinah definitely shows up, by the way.
The other thought I had is that what you're talking about is a sort of reverse projection. In other words, projection, you know what projection is, right? So there's a reverse projection saying, hey, it's not really inside me, it's outside, it's outside me.
That's right. Yes, right. No, I don't know either, but somehow it does. And I like the analogy you gave with the pain. And obviously, clearly, I was joking, and it's that would not be a way to see Shekhinah. But your analogy for recontextualizing your suffering in the light of something bigger, I think, is very helpful. Lenny Rand.
I just want to recapitulate what Cheryl said, because I think it was exactly right on. When you look at the Bina and Chachma, it's completely transcendent. It's not in this world at all. It's completely untainted by the world. And on the other hand of it, we have no experience of that in the world. It's the oil and vinegar don't mix at all.
Mm-hmm.
But the Shekhinah is where it mixes. And this is really like Catholic theology in a way. That's where God feels our pain. And so that when you address that and you help purify that, you purify it. This is maybe contrary to what you said before. When you purify that, that's where everything takes place, and you in turn are purified by it. That's where everything meets.
Right. Yeah, there's something you just said made me think of. There's many midrashim, which we don't normally think of as being part of the mystical tradition, but which Kabbalists certainly do think of as being part of the tradition, And these go back to the, the first couple hundred years after the exile. And they talk about the pain of the Shekhinah, right? Like the Shekhinah is in exile and is suffering terribly. So the Shekhinah goes into exile with the Jewish people, and it's the Shekhinah that's suffering, because the suffering of the people is the pain of Shekhinah. So anyway, so then I want to share with you another teaching. So in the Hebrew version of the book that we're reading, it traditionally comes with a commentary called the Makor Mayim Chaim, which means the source of living water. I don't think it's been translated into English, but it finds its way into some of the non-integer passages in here. In this, he doesn't present them as from the Makor Mayim Chaim, but like when it says 143.2, once in a while, it's actually a note from this traditional commentary. Anyway, there's one in here that's that I wanted to share with you. So this is as long as one experiences evil, or I put suffering, one is in a state of restricted consciousness. Okay, and I think I'd have to look at it again, but I think the word there is probably katnut, which means like smallness, small-mindedness. But by believing and saying gam zu latova, which means this too is for the good, then the good concealed within the suffering is actualized, and one has arrived at greater consciousness. So you may remember, you've probably heard of this guy. The Gemara talks about Nahum Ish Gamzu. That's his name, Nahum Ish Gamzu. And he would always say, Gamzu Latova, this too is for the good. That no matter what befalls you, if you just say that, it forces your awareness into this place where you can see that no matter anything that's happening is an unfolding of the divine. And that even if it looks like there's something that's bad, underneath everything is God's unfolding blessing that God is bringing to the world. Now, we don't get to necessarily see things play out like we would want to over the course of our lifetimes, but we're connected to a creation story, so to speak, the divine story unfolding that is definitely has good at its core, and that there's constantly goodness underneath everything. And therefore, as I wrote up here, there's no suffering within the world of unfolding divine reality. There is no evil. There is no evil ultimately. Now, again, to go back to the point that Anne made earlier, clearly when, God forbid, somebody does harm to another person or strikes them or whatever, clearly that is evil in the sense that that's an act that has to be addressed and justice has to be done, and we have to prevent that from happening again. But underneath it all, there's only goodness trying to manifest in the world. And if we cling to that reality, the unfolding divine reality, and we then take our responsibility as the people of Israel for trying to bring out awareness of God, then we're helping the goodness in the world manifest. Okay, so I wanted to share that. Then the last thing, and then we can just use the remainder of the time to talk or to go deep on any particular teaching. So the last thing he says, let me just see what number this is in. Okay, so this is this really challenging and beautiful idea, I think, on page 178, if I'm not, 177, 178, somewhere around them. There's this familiar idea that when we see evil in another, it teaches us something about ourselves, right? We can learn to use that power of judgment when we have conflict with another person and use it to educate ourselves. So let me just share two ways that I think this this happens. Excuse me, two proposals that he makes as to how we respond to conflict between people and the presence of evil in another person. And we'll get to, I think, a very, very important foundational teaching. So the first response that he gives is that when we see another person and we've judged them unfavorably because they do something annoying or wrongheaded, he says on 178, the judgments that emerge from the attribute of Gevura, okay, that's the divine quality that's within us that discerns and makes judgments. So the judgments that emerge from Gevura are sweetened, not by judging the people of the world unfavorably, but rather by consciously entering into the realm of compassion and cultivating a view of merit with regard to everyone. Okay, so the first step, which is on some level quite simple, at least simple to talk about, and as we all know, extremely difficult to put into practice, is just to make sure that you're tapping into, to me, it's useful to imagine it as like a beam of light coming down, that when I'm looking at another or at some circumstance, I'm just trying to feel that like beam of compassion and use that to see the other person. And God willing, people will also use that compassion to look at me and to make evaluations about things that I've done, rather than just sticking with the first thought, which is, oh, they shouldn't have done that, or God, that's annoying, or geez, that's so mean. It's okay if that's your first thought, but then you try to shift it to some thought of compassion. Wow, that person is really just exactly like me. And or that person is having a really, really difficult day, or I bet that person wishes they hadn't done that, or whatever it might be. Just try to shine the light of compassion on the person. So that's kind of this, it's almost like a Kabbalistic Musar lesson that he gives, just simply shifting the lens that we use to view. And what's important about this, I think, is that, and it's not a question of whether you can justify their act, right? Well, of course he got angry because someone hit him, right? But this applies even if you can't think of any mitigating circumstance. The person is just irrationally a jerk, right? There's no justification you can give for it. That's when it's even all the more important to draw upon compassion. Now, Kabbalistically, by the way, as an aside, what you're doing when you draw on compassion instead of Gevura, you're actually going up the Kabbalistic tree, right? You're coming closer to the undifferentiated light that unifies all things. But if that doesn't make any sense to you, it's okay to set that aside. Just simply put, use compassion to judge every living thing. Okay, we have that ability. But on a deeper level, and the more baffling teaching is the teaching that that I labeled this insightful mirroring. So one level of this insightful mirroring is that, as we said, you see something terrible in your fellow person, realize that came up in your awareness because that's something you have to work on, right? So that's one level. But then there's another teaching that, a couple of teachings that allude to this, 141 and 142. So that's going to be on page 176 and 177, where there's this wild idea that that not only we can be compassionate, and not only that we can see ourselves in that other person, but that actually all those who hate you and who distract you and who overcome you and spiritually, they actually come from the root of your neshama. And there's a footnote I found in this other commentary that says well, whatever, I'll set that aside. That he really mean, he doesn't just mean like, hey, remember you come from the same place, right? Which would be already one level. But he says, you caused that. And this is something that I don't know that I have the ability to teach this in depth, because I'm not sure that I fully get it. But or if it's just an imaginative exercise that he offers. But there's this idea that you yourself have caused whatever badness is in your fellow person. There's some part of your neshama that became distorted and gave rise to this action in the other person. Now, as soon as I say that, I really do want to say how terribly self-injuring this idea could be if taken too literally, right? This idea that like, God forbid, in an abusive relationship or just in processing ordinary difficulties, I would never say to somebody, well, that horrible thing happened to you, you should own it because you caused it, right? So like on a literal level, I think there's actually a very grave danger in that teaching that can really that does screw people up. I mean, I think one of the ways people make sense of a chaotic world when they've been traumatized is even though it's very painful, it's less painful than the chaos of meaninglessness. And so they say, well, there's something I did that caused this to happen to me. I don't accept that. I don't buy that. As a footnote, Rabbi David Hartman suggests, and he's not around anymore, he's not alive anymore to have him ask through the ethical implications of this teaching, but he says, well, of course that's not the case. Of course, a victim must never blame themselves. He said, in many cases, there can be a therapeutic benefit to saying ki'ilu, as if, right? If I were going to respond to this terrible evil by saying that it was something I did, is there some way I can grow through this and therefore sweeten this suffering event? But he's emphatically clear that it's a as if exercise. Anyway, so, but what I think emerges out of this at the core of it is that ultimately there is no you and me. That's what I think is the core platform, the foundation of this teaching. That this boundary of flesh and even of psychology and ego and essence and being that we perceive is entirely an illusion. And therefore the Baal Shem Tov can say, well, if something bad has happened, it's just an outgrowth of your own soul and your own actions. And only when everybody realizes that will we have the proper understanding that everybody's neshama is one, right? Because ultimately when we talk about neshama, okay, nefesh is the part of my soul that's like attached to my own physical body, to this body, Josh's body. That's nefesh. Ruach is like a little bit higher, and it interacts more with yours because it's sort of in the realm of emotion. Neshama is, I mean, I'm sort of doing this to signify like neshama is the one that really unifies us all. Neshama is where we really partake of the one. And when we keep that in mind, we see that any distinction we see between you and me, or you're doing something to me, is entirely an illusion. And it has to just be in the world of neshama where we're united. So I wanted to share that teaching, even as I don't fully understand all of its mechanics and its implications. That's what I wanted to bring to the table. And now let me see if you have questions or comments or particular teachings you wanted me to get to. We're good. We're sated with the light of God. Mickey, go ahead. Mickey,
I
and then
just want to thank you for changing the format. I think this format, at least for me, was much more enlightening as far as I could be enlightened than the reading, teaching by teaching. I really think I benefited a lot more by this format than the previous.
Okay.
And I also want to wish you a very, very happy birthday for the rest of the day.
Thank you, my friend. What about tomorrow? Not tomorrow, just today?
No, Joe, tomorrow, we'll worry about tomorrow.
Okay, fair enough. So what I wanted to say, thank you, and I would love other people's input on that. What I'm aware of in this format, I do think it's a better way to make clear to you what the core concepts are, but the downside is I'm hearing myself talking for 98% of the time, which I don't love, and I don't know how to strike that balance. Anybody
That's
else?
Zoom, that's Zoom for you. That's what happens in Zoom. When you
Right.
pray in Zoom, when you sing in
Right.
Zoom.
Right. Other reflections on this format versus others, or any other thing you want to talk about? Oh, Sean, you had a comment. Sorry.
Well, I had a question. Yeah, to go back to that text that you put up on the screen,
Yeah.
the line about there really is no such thing as evil.
Yeah. The Gamzu Latova, yeah, this too is for the good. Yep.
Yeah, this too is for the good. Wait, who is that idea attributed to in that text? There really is no such thing as evil. Is that to?
That was, so let me just see here. Oh, yeah, sorry. So the guy who said Gamzu Latova is in the Talmud, right here, Ta'anit 21a. But it was quoted in this context from the commentary that you don't have in front of you, from the Makor Chaim, Mayim Chaim, which is a commentary on the Baal Shem Tov.
Oh, I see. There is no suffering within the world of the unfolding divine reality. There is no evil at all.
Oh, well, sorry. This is me. This is just my writing to myself.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, okay. Well, I had a question about that then. I mean, but there is evil, and isn't it perhaps a good thing to recognize the existence of evil? Because by doing so, you're kind of
Yes.
you're like recognizing kind of a core tenet of God's creation. Okay, wouldn't you be in denial of God's creation?
Oh, really? Right.
If you're like in denial of evil. And I feel like I know people who are in denial of the existence of evil, and it does them no good.
Well, so yeah, it's a fabulous question, and this taps into what Ann Prohl was saying before. Again, I think we have to have a kind of my first part of the answer is I think we have to get to we have to have two levels. One is on the sort of operational level and the all important ethical. Absolutely, there's evil here, right? The whole Torah is founded on the distinction between good and evil, and we establish courts, and people who do wrong are to be punished, and we're supposed to teach people how to be good, teach ourselves how to be good. So absolutely, this is not about like, oh, that person killed somebody, but it's okay, it's all good, we'll just ignore it and things will work out. It's certainly not that. But it means on an existential level, underneath everything, there is goodness. And that therefore, any individual act of evil does not exhaust the potentials of creation. It doesn't, the existence of evil does not define what the nature of the world is.
I see. So it's just saying that no amount of evil can extinguish the potentiality for good. That there's no...
Yeah, I think maybe that's kind of a riff on what Lenny was saying, and I like how you put that. But to get to your other point, there's yes, absolutely. There's certainly God created evil. God created everything. So then, what do we do with that, right? Because that's a really, really great question, right? And the prophet Isaiah, I've pointed out to people before that we say in the Yotzer prayer, we thank God who
Yotzer or vorei choshech.
Yotzer or Yotzer or vorei choshech. Anyway, I'm blanking on the Hebrew, but there's one of the morning prayers before the Shema, the first prayer before the Shema, says that God creates light and darkness. God creates good and fashions all things. Okay, that is a deliberate misquote of what Isaiah says. So that's in the prayer book. What Isaiah says is that God creates good and God creates evil, right? And I think it's not in the prayer book because, as I always sort of half jokingly say, like in the morning prayers, like that's just too big of a thing to even wrestle with, right? Before you've had your 10th cup of coffee, the idea that we're blessing God for creating evil. So we say in the prayer book, God creates all things. But Isaiah says just plainly, God creates good, God creates evil. And now, but Kabbalistically, that is true. God allows for the possibility of evil when God creates the world, right? Because God is, in the model of Tzimtzum, of God's self withdrawing into God's self, in order to create space for anything else, God has to withdraw God's self, and therefore it makes space for evil. But what precedes that, remember, that was an active act by God to withdraw God's goodness. So what precedes and underlies everything is this like infinite flooding goodness in creation. And it's that God had to temporarily pull back a little bit to make space for us. So there's evil within that realm, but that's only temporary, because really what's all around it is goodness waiting to flood through again.
So evil is like the operating cost of free will? Is that what?
Yeah. Yeah. It's the operating cost of existence. Yep.
Fine.
Whether or not you think it's fine, that's the price you're paying, my friend. Lenny and then Cheryl.
I'll make this, I'll just present the takeaway from this. First of all, I'll say, if you want to teach chapter 10, you can't teach chapter 10. If you're going to do it teaching by teaching, you spend an hour on each one of those little things. So try and cut it short, I don't think works, but I'll just present my takeaway as kind of a Zen koan, that tzaddik who has achieved union with God is still expected to perform the punctilious practice of the mitzvot every day.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And that is, and actually, so Lenny's circling back to our earlier, this question of discernment and details versus unity, and why, if everything is one, why does it matter that we don't eat a piece of cheese after eating a kosher steak, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I mean, I talked about this on Shabbos. This is a question that is really, really has been kind of at the core of my concerns as a Jew. It's something I really wrestle with, and I can. So I was saying to Natan Meir yesterday, like I can kind of come up with all of the Jewish polemics about this, like, well, of course they're not opposed, like I know all that stuff, but as a lived experience of being a Jew, I want to say that they often really are in tension, at least for me. And but anyway, that's another topic. And then Cheryl, go ahead.
Yeah, this might be an answer a little bit to what I sort of keep hearing from Anne, which is, recognizing evil and what kinds of things in our plane of existence are evil is very important. But I don't think it's important for us to sort of seek out what's the evil in everything. I think it's important for us to seek out what's the good in everything. In way past days, I used to do therapy with people who very often were just not nice people. They were in trouble with the law and did who knows what. And for me, the only way I could work with those people, if I just stayed like, ew, I'm disgusted by you, I wouldn't have been able to do anything with them.
Right. Yeah.
And it was like a practice that I've had that's been very hard to maintain in the past 4 years. But he's like, what good can I find?
Yeah.
What's something in this person that I can relate to, that seems similar to me, that has some kind of good intention? And it's kind of like, that's what you look for. You're going to encounter evil, but you look for the good.
Right. Yeah, that's nice. And I think I think that's actually a beautiful way to a very beautiful and practical way to put it. I think in addition, what I'll say about this, because this is such an important topic that Anne raised, and I think it's and this is also very practically significant in our lives. I mean, meaning like in any community, but in the United States, that it's a question of what is justice for, right? So imagine if we approach the question of justice not from whenever there's evil, we have to crush it, right? But why do we have to crush evil, right? What is the ultimate point of punishing a criminal, right? So yes, of course, we must put justice into the world. We must be concerned with discerning good from bad. That's not a secondary concern. That's where Jews live, right? We got to do that. So I really want to hold up what is at the basis of Ann's question and Sean's comment. But when we ask, like, why do we have to do that? That's, I think, where mysticism comes flooding in. It's ultimately for tikkun ha'olam, because we're trying to repair the world and to bring it into a state of blessing and goodness for all beings. And so what would justice look like if that were our concern every time we had to punish a criminal, or we were looking for the root cause of some social ill? This is sort of like a politicized riff or a riff on the size of the polis to what Cheryl just said on the scale of the polis, right? Ultimately, it's about not just crushing evil, it's about allowing goodness to flood into the world. And that, I think it's within that context that we can think about how the oneness of Kabbalah fits together with the critical need to make discernments. We discern so that we can ultimately create goodness and harmony and blessing in people's real lives. And
what you're saying makes sense, but what the Baal Shem Tov is being quoted as saying is that a completely holy and pure person cannot even recognize evil anymore.
Yeah.
So I have to say I like your riff on it better than his, which is, I don't know, in a way it kind of makes me think that it opens up the potential for people to willfully not see it.
Yeah, I don't.
That they seem more holy.
Yeah,
I can't see that because I'm too holy.
Right. Well, this will be my last comment. Then we need to wrap it up. I think that you're right to be focused in on that teaching, because I think it is potentially troubling. For sure, what he is not saying is, you see somebody steal something or kill somebody, just, you can't, a real tzaddik doesn't know if that's good or bad. He's not saying that. I think probably what he means is that real tzaddik sees with such clarity the causal chain, or the spiritual chain, I should say, between that act and the root of God's goodness in the world, that I think he means he can't not see any act as being ultimately rooted into God's goodness. But I don't think it means that the tzaddik has an incapacity to see, somebody doing something horrible as evil. So, but that still may not be satisfying, but I think that's probably what it means. That tzaddik just sees everything in the light of God's ultimate goodness, and any bad act as being temporary and as being a distorted expression of God's goodness. All right, everybody. So listen, I would love your feedback, either real quick, thumbs up, thumbs down, or email me later, whatever, if you have more thoughts about whether this approach works or how to modify this approach. In terms of how I presented info, I get thumbs up from Harvey. Mickey liked it. Meyer liked it. Sarah liked it. Okay, looks like everybody. Good enough. So we're almost done with this thing. We're going to read chapter 11 for next time, and we might stay on it for a couple weeks. And then we'll see if people still have some Baal Shem Tov mojo. Then we'll look at some other teachings of a very different flavor. But anyway, I'll see you in a couple weeks. Take care.
Happy birthday again.
Sean, great to have you with us today. Thank you all. Be well. Bye-bye.
Happy birthday.
All right. Sean, talk to you soon.
Bye.